Boker Tov. Today's daf yomi is Bava Basra daf Kuf Nun. The Basra 150. Today's daf is dedicated for a Shmir for the Chayalim, Hatzah for the Shluyim and a Yeshua for Am Yisrael in this Eis Tzara. So the Gemara has recorded a dispute in yesterday's daf. We had said that if a shlimer, a person who's sick, leaves over kolshu of karka, if he leaves over in any amount of land when he gives away his gift, that's an indication that he doesn't view it as a dying gift because he left something over for himself. So what is the kolshu karka? What is that amount? So we saw a position in the Gemara that it was enough to sustain somebody, kadei parnasa, so enough to sustain them for a year. Rav Yosef says, no, karka means any amount, not just enough to sustain them for a year, any amount. So on today's daf, around 10 lines from the top, the Gemara says on daf kuf nun, Gemara asks the question, what does Rav Yosef mean when he says any amount? Why does he say kolshu means any amount? You mean to say kol hecha detane kolshu leisleishi? Or again, there's a dispute. What does the words kolshu mean? Does it mean any amount, or does it mean a specific amount? So the first shita, which we saw in yesterday's daf, which was the shita of, hold on, which was the position of Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav, was that it was enough to support you. But Rav Yosef said it was any amount. So now the Gemara asked the question, or do you mean to say wherever it says kolshu, it means any amount? But didn't we learn Rav Dosef and Horkinis taught, and this comes from the Mishnah in Chulin, and the discussion of Reishis Hagez. This is the idea that there is a mitzvah from the Torah to give the first of your shearings to a Kohen, the first of the shearings of the wool to the Kohen. So how much, what are the amounts for that? So Rabbi Dosef ben Horkaner says that if you have chamesh rochos, if you have 5 lambs, goes as mana and manu pras, and each of the lambs, your shear from each of the lambs, 1.5 manas, then chayavos bereshis hagez. Then you have to give on this amount you have to take from here and give to the Kohen. How much you have to give to the Kohen? Biblically speaking, you just have to give a small amount. But rabbinically speaking, we require more. But anyway, we say, goes, those kol shein. Kol shein, amarav, mano prospo, amarav, mano prospo, vachu milchumashos. So Rav says, in that position, the Chachamim are of the position that it's 5 gozazos are the kol shein. Meaning to say, excuse me, I got distracted. Let me read this again. Now, Rabbi Dosef ben Horkaner says 5 lambs, and each of the lambs has 1.5 manas, and that's what the minimum requirement for Reishis Hagez. And the Chum say chamesh rechelos goes to those kol shein. That if the Chum are of the position that it's if you have 5 lambs, that even if you shear kol shein, even if you do a little amount, the and we say how much are this kol shein, the kama kol shein, amarav mano paras mano pras ubavad shu mechumashos. So Rav says it's that together they have to equal 1.5 mana, and as long as they are each of them providing 1/5. So we see from here that the kol shehu doesn't mean a minuscule amount; it has a specific amount. And what is that amount? And that is, in the case of the lambs, it has to be 1.5. So why would Rav Yosef say it's just a minuscule amount? And the Gemara says no. Hasam medinu duolis ne kol shehu. Really, there it shouldn't have used that language kolshu. Rav Yosef would say it's imprecise. But I did the kamar tanakama shiura rabba, but it's only stylistically because the first position in the Brisa in the Mishnah Rav Dosef ben Horkaner said a large amount. So therefore, Amar Iyu nami shira zutra. So the Chachamim also said a smaller amount, and Karilo kolshu. So they call that small amount kolshu, but really it's not a kolshu. It's really a significant amount, but it just in relationship to the large amount, it's the kolshu. Now the Gemara says Pshita, it's obvious that if you use the language of metaltali with Puranya, you use the language of I'm going to give this, the movables to this man, that means afilu kol mani tashmishan, that refers to just your utensils you're giving over to him. Kol mani tashmisha kani. Mavar mechita yusari, but does not include your wheat and your barley. If you say kol metaltali l'playim, but if you say I'm giving all my movables to this man, then afilu chiti utzari, that includes even wheat and barley. Afilu rechayim elyona, and even you have a millstone. There are two parts, even the upper part, which sometimes you need to remove in order to fix. So since you say kol, that includes even the upper mill. Lavarmi rechayim atachtonim, but not including the lower part of the millstone. And call the metaltel, if you use the language of anything that can move, then rechaim tachtonim kodim. Then you've even given over the the lower part of the mill. So now the Gemara asks the fundamental question: Avda kemekarka or kemetaltel? How do we view an eved? Do we view an eved as karka, as real estate, or as like a movable? So obviously this question is even offensive to talk about nowadays, but in the time of most of human history up until 250 years ago, the whole world was engaged in this type of activity. So they needed to know legally the process. So an eved was like a mekarka or like a talpin. So let's try and bring a proof from Let's try and bring a proof from the Brisa that we already had earlier in our Masechta. Mocharas a year, one who sells a city, Mochar Batim, Shichem Oros Berchatzos, Ubeis Abadim, Ubeis Hashlachim. If you sell the city, you've sold the houses in it, the wells, the bathhouses, the olive presses. All these things are attached to the ground. Avalois Metaltoim. We have not sold the movables. But if you say I'm selling the city and everything that's in it, then behema or avadim. Then even if there are animals or avadim in it, you sold it. So now says the Gemara. Now if you want to say an avid is like a metalto and that's why when you sold the whole city and it only includes the things attached to the ground, that's why it doesn't include the avadim because they're not attached to the ground. They're metalton, they're movables. But if you want to say it's like real estate, why are the Evan not sold with the rest of the city? That when you sold the property, the real property of the city. So Gemara says, you want to say that it's a movable. So if that's the case, so if you're saying why even, it could just say all movables, and then obviously it would include avadim. Why does it say even avadim? Or you would have to say that the author of the Brisa was saying you might have thought shani metalto or denai metalto donai, that there's a distinction between the types of movables, the distinction between the movables that move and the movables that don't move. And so we're saying if you sell the city, you've even sold the movables that move. But if that's the case, you could even say you could even say it's like real estate and shani karka denayin and karka delonayin, and there's just a distinction between the real estate that moves and the real estate that doesn't move, and so therefore it's not an indication that slaves are not real estate. Amalei Ravino Rav Ashi, so we're trying to prove this. Let's prove this from our Mishnah. Akosev. It says in the Mishnah in Peah, this is the Mishnah we've been discussing the last couple of days. Akosev. Somebody who writes kol nechasav, somebody writes to his eved kol nechasav, somebody who gives over to his kosev kol nechasav ha'avdo, somebody who writes all of his assets to his eved. So under those circumstances, yatsa ben chor. And then since he said I'm giving all my assets to my eved, obviously it's including the eved, and the eved goes free. But shear, again, shear means when you left something over, shear karka kolshu. But if you left over a little bit of karka, says the Mishnah, lo yatsa ben chorin, he does not go free. That indicates that the little bit of karka can be a reference to the eved, and the eved is therefore karka. So Rabbi Shimon Amar olamu ben chorin. Rabbi Shimon says no, he's free even if he left over a little bit of karka, Achi Omar, unless he says, Kol Nachasai, Vituni Laponi Avdi, all my assets are given to Ploni, my Eved, Chutzmi Echami Ribo Shaban, exception of 1 in 10,000. So, and he doesn't say which is the 1 in 10,000. So we say so that it's possible that his intent was to leave over the Eved. And now we're going to see why this is an attempt to prove. V'amar Rav Dimi Bar Yosef, and we already had this at the top of the Amud, which we had on yesterday's talk. It says Rav Dimi Bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Lazar, also metalton shir etzel Eved, v'asu metalton shir etzel ksuva. If you say that he left it over with movables with respect to an Eved, he said, I'm giving you everything except for this movable, then it's like you left something out, and the slave is going to be, under those circumstances, not given his freedom. And so we see from here that the slave is going to be considered the metaltoin, and but not with respect to a ksuba. This is a case which we had at the top of the daf, which we discussed in yesterday's top of the Amma, which we discussed in yesterday's daf, that if a man gives all of his assets to his sons and nothing to his wife, we assume that she wouldn't have waived her right. But if he says, I'm giving all my assets to my sons except for a piece of land, which is the ksuba, then we assume that his wife said, okay, that's my ksuba. But if he gave it all away, she really was just too intimidated to say that she was waiving her rights. But let's say he says, give everything except for a movable, well, then she hasn't waived her rights to her ksuba. So the movable is considered a shiur, something that's left over and ruins the deal for the slave, but not for the woman. So anyway, we see from here, because the slave himself is like a movable. And so therefore, if you say, I'm giving everything to the slave, except for 1 in 10,000, then we're going to say, then the slave is that movable. And so therefore, he does not go free. So metaltal have a shiur. And so a movable left over for a movable is a leftover. So therefore, the slave doesn't get its freedom. And the ksuva, that bond comes from real estate. Therefore, metaltal karka have a shiur. So the movable for the real estate is not going to be considered like he left anything out. And so therefore, the woman had just basically would have waived her whole ksuba, and that she wouldn't do. So anyway, the upshot of this is Gemara saying that this proves a slave is like movables. So the Gemara says, no, Amarle, Anan, Ravasha, he says to Ravina, this is not a proof. Why? On top of 150b. Anan mishum delav krispita mas nisanla. Now, what's the reasoning why the slave does not go free? It's not because, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, it's not because, excuse me, it's not because that the slave is immovable, but because in order for a slave to be granted its freedom, it needs to be an entire severance. You can't hold anything on, and so therefore, so the language needs to be a complete severance. He needs to complete with this contract. There needs to be no attachments, and so since in the contract it says that the movables are remaining with the master, so it proves that the rights of the master are written into the contract, and that messes up the language. So according to this approach, even if he specified, I'm giving you all my assets except for, let's say, one stender or one table, that also is not a language of severance, and the slave and the Eved would not get his freedom under those circumstances. That's the Rashbam's approach. That's the Rashbam's approach. Not everybody accepts that approach. Okay. Now we have the next question. So this next question is basically a summary of what we've been studying, but it adds on something else. So Amar Rav Nachman Chamisha Ad Sheyichtevu Kol Nechaseim. There are 5 cases where they only take effect if you write, I'm giving all my assets. But if you don't say I'm giving all my assets, then the special circumstances of this law don't apply. But Elaine Shchimera, we'll go over them. Abdo, Ishto, Banav, mavrachas. So what's a shlimera? Shlimera, remember, is the person who gives away all his assets because he thinks he's going to die, and then he recovers. So since he only gave it away because he thought he was going to die, the gift is reversible. But it's not shlimera cost of kol nechos of acherim v'shir karka kolshu. But that's only if he gives all of his assets. If he left over some real estate, then matanaso kayemes. Then it's not going to be considered a shlimera gift. His gift is not reversible. Lo shir karka kolshu. But if he didn't leave over anything, matanaso kayemes. If he didn't leave anything over, then his gift is reversible. What about the avdo? The Tanan we just said. If somebody writes all of his assets to a slave, the Yatsa Ben Choron, the slave goes free. But Shir, Karka Kolshu, he says, I'm giving all my assets, but I'm leaving over a little bit of real estate. Lo Yatsa Ben Choron. Then the slave does not go free because we say that what he left over was the slave. Ishta, what's the case of his wife? And this was the case we had earlier in our Masechta on Daf 131. Kuf Lamed Aleph Amid Beis. Actually, we had it more than once in our Masechta. We also had it on Kuf Mem Daled Amid Aleph, and we also had in Gittin. Somebody writes all of his assets to his wife. Lo Asa El Apatrapa. He's not really giving them all to his wife because we said that, even though we said there's the Hilchasa below the time, the reason is because he would not want to completely disinherit his children. So he's just made his wife the manager of this state, but he's not giving her everything. What's the fourth case? Banav Ditanan. Somebody who says, I'm giving all my assets to his children, meaning to say he's taking away the wife's ksuva because of ishto karka kolshu of the ksuva. So if he says, I'm giving all my assets to my wife, we say the wife has not waived her ksuva. But if he gives all of his assets except for a piece of land, then she's waived her rights to the ksuba because she's transferred her ksuba to that piece of land. What's the case of the mavrachas? The case of the mavrachas is the amar ma'ar mavrachas tzricha shetichtov kol nechatzah. So the mavrachas has to write all of her assets. So what's this case of the mavrachas? The mavrachas is a woman, Rashbam says, who basically is either she's widowed and she's remarrying and she doesn't want her husband to get the assets that she had, her new husband to get the assets she had from the first husband. She wants them, she doesn't want her husband to take them. So she could give them before she dies to another man, or to her children. And when she gives them, then the person will return them to her. And in order to make it clear that she never really intends to give these away or to sell them, then she has to give all of her assets. Then in the case where she left nothing for herself, then the assumption is clear that the whole transaction was only to hide the assets from her husband. There's a dispute amongst the Rishonim whether she requires witnesses for this transaction or not, but that's the upshot. But if it's not all, then we say that whatever she sold or gave away was in fact a valid, irreversible gift. With a kula, in all these cases, if she left over movables from the kol, in all these cases, if there was a movable left over, that's considered like you left something over and the law doesn't take effect. If you leave over movables, that's considered a shir, a bar miksuba. With the exception of the case of the ksuba, and why is it with the exception of the case of the ksuba? Because the ksuba is collected only from real estate. The rabbis do not collect the ksuba from movables. And Amar Amar mimetaltli the ksuba b'ksuba ve'istim be'anayu have a shir. Member says no. If there are certain metaltom which are worth so much money that they're written in the ksuba, so if that was what was excluded from what he gave to his sons, that actually would be considered like a shir, and she would say that's where I'm collecting my ksuba from. So now the Gemara is very technical, telling us if a person says, I'm selling you my nechasim, my possessions, what's included in that phrase? Amar nichsi lepulanya. He says, I'm giving you my nechasim to this person. Then we're going to say, Abda ikri nechasi. That can include also your avadim, also your slaves are called nechasim. The Tanan HaKosef called nechasav Abda. We learn in the Mishnah, one who says all of his assets to his slave, Yatsa ben Choron. He goes free. Ara, Ikri nechasi. If you say I'm giving you my nechasim, this could also refer to land. It's not nechasim sheyesh nechrayis niknim b'kesef shtar v'chazaka, because that's possessions that are yesh nechrayis, which is real estate, are acquired with kesef shtar chazaka, money, contract, and a chazaka. So we see from here, real estate is also called nechasim. Kuima, clothing, is ikri nechasim. That's also called nechasim. It's not m'she'ein nechrayis ein niknin el b'mashicha. If they have no achrayis, you have to acquire them with pulling. And so we see from here, movables are considered nechasim. Zuzi ikri nechasim. Cash is called nechasim. How do we know this? From the case that we had. And how do we know this? They can be acquired with money, contract, and a presumptive status. Also, so how do we know that money is called nechasim? Because we know that money can be acquired via real estate, by dint of the real estate. And this was the case that Rav Papa, he had 12,000 zuz. We had this case several times already in the Shas. We had it earlier in 77. We had in Bamitzia. We had in Bava Kama. The Rav Papa had 12,000 zuz, and it was far away. It was with the Bechuzai, and they wouldn't send it with them, with their own agent, because then if it was lost, they'd be responsible. So Rav Papa gave it over, was maknet to his agent, Rav Shmuel Bar Acha, and he did this via the lintel of the household, the safe of the base. And when Rav Shmuel Bar Acha came out to greet him, he went to Tevach. What's Tevach? Rashbam says two explanations. It could be a place, and some say half of the road. Or maybe, okay, so those are the two explanations of the Rashbam. We see from here, money is also called nechasim. Shtari ikri nechasia. Also, a contract is called nechasim. How so? The Amar Bar Yitzchak Shnei Shtaros, saying there are two laws with respect to contracts. That, let's say a person says, Zachul b'sada zelaponi, says, I want you to acquire this field on behalf of this man. Vikas v'lo as a shtar, write a contract. Choser b'shtar, he can reverse himself on the contract because they didn't do a kinyan on it. Meino choser b'sada, but once he tells them, I'm giving you the assets, he can't go back on the field because he made the kinyan on the field. But he says, but he says on the condition that you write for him this contract, then then he could go back on both. Because it was conditional. Rav Chia Bar Abba says the name of Rav Huna. Shlosh Shtar is saying these two. There are three laws about contracts: Trey Hani da Amran and Idach. And what's the third one? Imkada Mocher v'Kosav Asashtar. If the seller went and in advance wrote the contract, which is allowed, Kozen Sheshanino, like we learned, Kosvin Shtar Mocher Afapisha Elokeach Imo. Now you can write the contract for the seller on top of 151A, even though the purchaser is not with him. Then Kimin Sheichzak Bekar Kozeh, Kimin Sheichzak Zeh Bekarka Nikna Shtar Kol Makom Shehu. And then once he does the proprietary act on the real estate, then he has acquired the contract wherever it is. And this teaches us, and this is why it's a proof. Nechasim she'ein nachrayas is movables, which is the contract. Nickname can be acquired by the property because of shtar chazaka. So we see from here that a contract is also called nechasim. What about a behema, an animal? That's also ikri nechasim. That's also called nechasim. D'tanan, a makdish nechasim, somebody who consecrates his nechasim. V'aisaban behema ru'uyo agavi mizbech. Amongst them is an animal worthy to be brought on the altar. Zacharim olos unakevos. You have males. The males will be zacharim olos. The males will be brought as an oil offering. Unakevos, and the female karbanos. Yimachru etzarchei zivchei shlamim. You sell them. And you bring the carbon shlamim. Bring with it. You basically, we learned in this Mishnah in Shkolim that the female, since they can only be brought as a shlamim, you sell them for those who need to bring a carbon shlamim, and you take from their money olos. And so this proves that animals are also called nechasim. The what's the reason why the female animals are not directly brought as a carbon? Is because he really wanted the animals to be brought as an ola, and the shlamim is partially owned by a human being. And now he'd say, I know I'm going a little bit longer because I wanted to get to this point in just a minute. Ofo sikri nechasi. Also, the birds are called nechasim. And how do we know that birds are called nechasim? Because it states it's not a makdish nechasav. That let's say it says in the Mishnah in Shkolm, if you consecrate your nechasim, and included within it is that ophos. Tefillin ikru nechasim. Tefillin are also called nechasim. It's not a makdish nechasav that somebody consecrates all his assets. Malan lo tefillin. That is, tefillin are consecrated. He has to evaluate and give the value of the tefillin. And now we call me Bialu Sefer Torah. What about a Torah scroll? If somebody says, "I'm giving you all my assets," does that include your Torah scroll? Do we say Kivan Dolom is Dabin since it's not sold? Why? The also is a Bune, because you're not allowed to sell a Torah scroll. Therefore, it's not called an asset. Udelma, Kivan Dim is Dabin Lomo Torah V'Lisa Isha. You're allowed to sell a Torah scroll to study Torah and to raise money so you could go to yeshiva, or also to marry a woman, you could sell it. So therefore, it's called nechaseh. It's called nechasim. Nechasehu. So therefore, we say we leave this question unresolved. Rashbam has a different girsa. Rashbam says Sefer Torah is it called nechasim like tefillin, or maybe tefillin is a malbush. Tefillin is a clothing, you wear it, but the Sefer Torah is a mitzvah and it's not an asset. And even though you could sell it, it's not called nechasim. So that's how Rashbam says the question. We see from here that the Sefer Torah is the one possession you have, which is not an asset. Everything else in the world is an asset. The Sefer Torah is the one thing you have that's not an asset. It's above an asset. It's worth even more than an asset. All right, we want to stop here, but we say, of course, to Rabbi Yosef and everyone,